My name is Pamela. I am 32 years old, and I once believed in fairy tale endings. 3 years ago, my life took a dramatic turn when I met Mark, the man who became my husband. This is our story, a journey of love, trust, and, ultimately, betrayal. Amid what seemed to be a perfect marriage, everything began on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday that would change my fate. Exhausted after yet another endless office meeting, I stopped by Corner Cafe, intending to escape the hustle and bustle for a while. In my hands was a John Grisham novel, one of those books that always guarantee an escape into another world. I found a cozy table by the window, where soft light lazily streamed through dusty curtains. The hum of the coffee machine mixed with the subdued chatter of patrons, creating an atmosphere that made it easy to forget everything. I opened my book and, barely finishing the first page, felt something shift behind me. Mark entered as if the space belonged to him. His tall figure was impossible to miss. He moved with an easy grace yet carried himself with a confidence that stopped short of arrogance. His smile was warm, his eyes playful as they scanned the room before landing on me. "Hey, is that Grisham's latest?" His voice came unexpectedly close. I looked up, slightly surprised. His tone carried a mix of friendliness and genuine interest. "Yes, I just started it." "His books are always so captivating," I replied with a smile, surprised at how easily the words tumbled out. Thus began our conversation, which, on the surface, seemed so ordinary yet carried a lightness, as if we had known each other our whole lives. We talked about books that inspired us, debated the significance of classics, and laughed at mistakes and adaptations. Mark was charming. His humor was light but thoughtful, and his eyes held a warmth that made me smile. The following weeks passed in a blur. Mark and I met almost every day, and with each meeting, it felt like another layer of his personality was revealed. He was remarkably attentive. He remembered little things, like my dislike of strong coffee or that I always preferred sitting by the window. We spent hours discussing music, especially old jazz, which he had loved since childhood. Those melodies, almost alive, became the soundtrack to our dates, enveloping us in warmth and a strange, deep melancholy. We also shared a love for bookstores. Wandering through the city, we found old, almost forgotten shops filled with worn volumes with yellowed pages. Every time we stumbled upon something unique, Mark would look at me with excitement, as if the discovery was meaningful not just to him but to both of us. One day, during a walk along the river, he stopped abruptly, his expression suddenly serious. I sensed he was about to say something important. In the glow of the streetlights, his face appeared focused and slightly nervous. "Pamela," he began, and something in his voice made my heart race. "I've never felt this way before. I think I'm falling in love with you." His words froze me in place. In that moment, it felt like everything around us went silent. Only the sound of the water and a faint breeze reminded me I wasn't dreaming. A wave of warm, almost painful happiness swept over me. "I feel the same, Mark," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met." I didn't know where I found the courage to admit my feelings at that moment. But his smile, the same warm smile I noticed when we first met, was all the reassurance I needed. We stood there under the dim light of the street lamps, and the world around us seemed to fade away. 6 months flew by, and our relationship only grew stronger. Then, during a cozy dinner at my apartment, Mark, looking slightly nervous, stood up from the table and, taking my hand, unexpectedly knelt on one knee. He didn't pause or hesitate, his gaze, filled with warmth, spoke for him. "Pamela, you've made my life better than I could have imagined. You're not just the woman I love, you're the person I want to share every moment with. Will you marry me?" The moment was simple but profoundly sincere. I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. There was no hesitation. "Yes," I replied with a smile, barely holding back tears of happiness. It was more than just a word. It was a promise born from the depths of my heart. Our engagement brought joy, but soon after, the first challenges emerged. Meeting Mark's parents came sooner than I had expected. His mother, Linda, was a woman of iron will and piercing eyes that made you uneasy. She exuded an ideal of restraint, every gesture radiating authority, not from kindness, but from an apparent desire to control everything. His father, on the other hand, was more affable, though his demeanor carried an unmistakable sternness, especially when the topic of marriage came up. The evening of our first dinner at their house began with pleasant yet tense discussions about our wedding, but soon took an unexpected turn. Mark's father, adjusting his glasses and setting down his fork, spoke up. "Linda and I think that a prenuptial agreement would be a reasonable decision. It's just practical. We've always believed in protecting our children's interests." I tensed, unprepared for this twist. For a moment, I was at a loss, but memories of the past, of trusting someone who had betrayed me, gave me inner strength. I looked at them with confidence, striving to remain calm. "I agree," I replied after a brief pause, but added, "I have one condition. If either of us cheats, the cheater pays the other $100,000. For a moment, silence enveloped the table. Linda's face remained impassive, though a flicker of surprise crossed her eyes. Mark, on the other hand, looked stunned, but to my relief, his face broke into a smile. "I promise you, Pamela," he said, looking straight into my eyes, "I will never betray you." His words sounded sincere, and I wanted to believe him, to believe that this time my heart was safe. Our wedding was a fairy tale. A white tent on a lush green lawn, floral arches, guests, smiles, dancing, and vows that seemed to illuminate the very air around us. When Mark took my hand, looked into my eyes, and spoke his vows, I felt that every word he said was true. The first year of our marriage was filled with joy and tranquility. We honeymooned in Paris, a city that wrapped us in romance. We strolled through the streets, enjoying the sounds of street musicians, and sampled baguettes and cheese in little cafes. One evening, sitting by the Seine, we watched as the Eiffel Tower lit up. Mark pulled me close and said, "With you, I can believe in anything." Those words stayed with me, like a vow he made in that moment. We returned home full of memories and suitcases stuffed with trinkets, each one a part of our story. Our days were filled with a cozy routine. In the mornings, Mark kissed me before leaving for work, and in the evenings, we dined together, sharing the details of our day. We talked about everything, small things, dreams, plans. Sometimes our conversations stretched late into the night, and on weekends, we hosted movie marathons or drove aimlessly around the city, simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as we cleaned the kitchen after dinner, Mark suddenly said, "You know, I never thought I'd be this happy doing something as mundane as washing dishes." Smiling, I playfully splashed him with water. "That's because you have an amazing wife, that's all," I said, laughing. He pretended to catch the splash in his hands, but the genuine joy in his eyes was unmistakable. "Marrying you was absolutely the best decision of my life," he said, looking at me warmly. However, behind this idyllic life, there was pressure. At every family gathering, subtle but persistent questions about children were raised. "When?" they would ask, their smiles seeming slightly forced. I felt as though time was ticking, like a clock set by someone else. Mark's mother, Linda, often made less than subtle hints. "So, when will we hear some good news?" she asked one Sunday at lunch. Her tone, laden with expectation, made me shrink inside. I tried to deflect with a joke, "Oh, you'll be the first to know when there's news," but her persistence only grew with each visit. These questions, innocent at first, then vague, and later increasingly direct, began to wear on me. Mark noticed my discomfort. "Don't let my mom get to you," he said, gently wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "We'll start a family when we're ready, not a minute sooner." His words reassured me, but only temporarily. Linda was relentless, her pressure mounting as though she was deliberately testing my patience. Despite her behavior, the first year of our marriage remained magical. We celebrated our first anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. Mark, as always, showed his thoughtfulness and care. He cooked my favorite dish for dinner and then presented me with a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace I had admired months earlier in a jewelry store window. "Happy anniversary, Pamela," he said, his eyes shining with love. "Here's to many more years of happiness together." I felt tears well up and softly said, "Thank you, Mark. I couldn't have dreamed of a better partner." That evening, as we cuddled on the couch, I couldn't help but feel incredibly fortunate. I had a husband who loved me, a cozy home, and a future that seemed bright and full of promise. But as our second year of marriage began, Linda's pressure started to weigh on me more heavily. Her criticisms extended beyond the issue of children. She began to nitpick everything. Her visits to our home became a nightmare. She would appear unannounced, always with a stern expression, and find fault with everything. One afternoon, as I was setting the table for lunch, Linda walked into the kitchen and cast a disapproving glance at me. "Is this what you're serving?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her tone dripped with disdain. I clenched my teeth, trying to maintain my composure. "I thought we'd enjoy something light today," I replied as calmly as I could. She merely sniffed and muttered something under her breath about proper nutrition and managing a household. Her criticisms didn't stop at my cooking. She found flaws in how I decorated the house, how I spent my free time, and even in how I dressed. Each of her visits left me feeling humiliated and crushed. One evening, as Mark and I were relaxing in the living room, Linda decided to share her unsolicited opinion. "You know, Pamela," she began, with a slight smile that felt more like a sneer, "if Mark gave me the money he spends on you, I could hire a real housekeeper and chef." I waited for Mark to say something in my defense, but he only smiled awkwardly, not saying a word. His silence burned, like a betrayal. I was seething inside, but I still managed to respond, "Linda, I'm doing my best. What more do you want?" What hurt the most wasn't even her comment, but the way Mark's behavior began to change. He started echoing his mother's criticisms, albeit more subtly. After one of Linda's visits, he casually mentioned, "Mom's probably right about the house. Maybe we should consider getting some help." Those words stung. "So, you think I'm not managing either?" I asked, unable to hide my disappointment. "No, that's not what I meant," he quickly backtracked, but the damage had been done. Linda's constant criticism and Mark's growing detachment strained our marriage. We started arguing over trivial matters that we once overlooked. Conversations that were once light and easy now often turned into tense exchanges. After one particularly heated argument, I retreated to the bedroom, feeling a lump of hurt and exhaustion rise in my throat. The home I once considered my sanctuary now felt like a battleground. I found myself asking out loud, "What happened to us, Mark? We used to be a team." My voice trembled, but I tried to hold myself together. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his face looking tired and troubled. "I don't know, Pamela," he replied softly, avoiding my gaze. "Everything just feels so complicated now." His words left me in turmoil. That night, I fell asleep with a deep loneliness gnawing at me. Linda's comments had seeped into the walls of our home and into the heart of our marriage, like poison. I began to wonder if the love Mark and I shared was strong enough to withstand this constant wave of negativity. By the third year of our marriage, a growing sense of unease had taken root in my heart. The once bright flame of our love seemed dim, flickering under the weight of doubt and mistrust. It all began with a phone call, or rather, several calls that started coming with unsettling regularity. The name that flashed on Mark's phone screen was unfamiliar to me, Jake. I couldn't help but notice how Mark's demeanor changed whenever that name appeared on his screen. One evening, as we watched television, his phone rang again. The screen lit up. Jake. Mark quickly silenced the call and put his phone away, but not before I caught his nervous glance. "Who's Jake?" I asked, striving to keep my voice calm, though a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. "Oh, just a new guy at work," Mark replied with a shrug. "No one important." But his voice sounded too casual, his words too rehearsed. Over time, his behavior grew even more suspicious. He began coming home late, blaming it on an increased workload. His excuses felt flimsy, sometimes outright contradictory. Even his wardrobe changed. Gone were his usual casual clothes, replaced by sharp, tailored suits. It all seemed strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. One evening, as he prepared to leave for yet another late-night work session, I could no longer suppress my emotions. His polished appearance, dressed up with perfectly styled hair, looked far too put together for office work. "This isn't like you, Mark. What's really going on?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. He sighed, his face darkening. "I told you, it's just work. Why can't you trust me?" His tone was irritated, but a flicker of guilt flashed in his eyes. "Because you're hiding something. You're never home, and when you are, it feels like you're a million miles away." I burst out, desperation rising in my chest. Mark grabbed his coat and left without another word, leaving me standing alone in the living room. That night, lying in our empty bed, I made a decision. I could no longer live with these doubts and suspicions. I needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. The next morning, swallowing my pride, I contacted a private detective agency. It felt like a betrayal, but the constant anxiety and uncertainty were eating me alive. I needed answers. For several days after that, I lived in a state of tense anticipation. Every phone call, every knock at the door felt like it could bring the inevitable truth. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but inside, my world felt like it was crumbling. And then one day, the call came. The call. My heart froze as I answered. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Detective Wilson. We have undeniable evidence." "I'm afraid your suspicions were correct." Those words, spoken in a dry, professional tone, shattered my last glimmer of hope. The detective's voice was solemn and heavy, each phrase landing on me like a weight. He explained that Mark had been having an affair. The mysterious Jake, who kept calling his phone, turned out to be a woman. My heart sank as the detective began detailing the evidence, meetings, timestamps, photos. The proof was undeniable. I sat with the phone in my hand, feeling a mix of devastation and a strange sense of vindication. My worst fears were no longer just fears. They had transformed into cold, harsh facts. Despite the pain, I decided not to confront Mark immediately. I needed more than just proof of his infidelity. I wanted to uncover the full extent of his deceit. One evening, as I passed by his home office, I overheard a conversation that sent chills down my spine. "Mom, I plan to end things with Pamela after your birthday." Mark's voice was cold, devoid of any affection he once had for me. "That's wise, dear. Just make sure she gets me a nice gift for my 65th before you drop the bomb," Linda replied in her cool, emotionless tone. I froze, leaning against the wall, feeling nauseous. Not only had my husband been unfaithful, but he and his mother were conspiring against me. Their calculated malice was staggering. They planned to use me for one last gift and then discard me. For the first time in my life, I felt not just pain, but a fiery determination. Collecting my thoughts, I decided to play along. I continued pretending I knew nothing and secretly gathered more evidence. The detective provided everything: photos, videos, audio recordings. I was building my case, preparing for the moment when I would strike back. Each night, Lying in bed next to the man who had betrayed me, I crafted my plan. I knew I had to wait for Linda's 65th birthday. I would let them believe they had outsmarted me, only to reveal everything and turn the tables in my favor. The celebration approached. I wore a mask of ignorance, acting as if everything was fine. Inside, however, a storm of emotions brewed: anger, betrayal, determination. A few days before the party, Linda casually mentioned her upcoming milestone during a family dinner. "Pamela, I hope you've planned something grand for my 65th birthday," she said, her smile laced with veiled anticipation. Suppressing my emotions, I replied with a light smile, "Of course, Linda. I've arranged a dinner at the most luxurious restaurant in the city. It will be an unforgettable night." Her eyes sparkled with delight, oblivious to the trap I was setting. "How wonderful, Pamela. That's so thoughtful of you," she said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. I confirmed her expectations with a touch of hidden irony. "Yes, it will be a very intimate event, just for close family." Late that night, as I was preparing for bed, Mark entered the room. His gaze was slightly suspicious. "That's a rather generous plan for my mom's birthday." "Are you sure it's necessary?" he asked, his tone cautious, as if he sensed something amiss. I looked at him, maintaining my composure. "Why not? It's her milestone birthday. She deserves something special," I replied, infusing my voice with a softness that concealed the storm within. Mark nodded, but his expression remained pensive. He tried to read something on my face, but I gave him nothing. His doubts didn't concern me. I knew I needed to play my role until the very end. My plan was simple but flawless. They thought they had control of the situation, but in reality, I was the one pulling the strings. The closer Linda's birthday drew, the more I relished this game of duality. With every smile, every kind word, I fortified my resolve for the moment when the truth would be laid bare. The day of Linda's milestone birthday arrived, and I knew I would make it special. The restaurant was resplendent with luxury: high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and the soft glow of candlelight, all creating an air of exclusivity. Linda basked in the attention of the guests, her laughter filling the room. I smiled and engaged in conversations, carefully concealing my inner turmoil. As dinner drew to a close, the waiter brought the check. The total, $4,500, reflected the extravagance of the evening. With a steady hand, I reached for my card, feeling my heart race. Swiping it through, I glanced around the table. Linda looked smug, pleased with her victory. Mark, however, seemed uneasy, his gaze shifting as if he were bracing himself for something. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Pamela." "This was truly generous of you," Linda said, her voice oozing with false gratitude. Mark leaned toward me and finally spoke. His words were cold, cutting like a blade. "By the way, Pamela, I want a divorce." Those words pierced me like a sharp dagger. My chest tightened, but I refused to let them see my pain. Linda, seizing the moment, added with a haughty smirk, "Well then, I think you should leave. After all, this is a family gathering." I stood up silently, maintaining my dignity despite the storm raging inside me. Without saying a word, I left the restaurant, feeling the quiet of the night city envelop me. But before leaving everything behind, I pulled out my phone and canceled the payment on the bill. Then, with cold certainty, I froze our joint bank account so Mark couldn't pay for the evening. Back home, I quickly packed my things. There were no tears, just a sense of finality. The house that was once filled with dreams now felt like an empty shell. Leaving it behind, I left everything that tied me to this chapter of my life. My phone rang. Linda's name flashed on the screen. I answered, only to hear her shrill, rage-filled voice. "What have you done, Pamela?" "The payment didn't go through. The restaurant staff called the police." "Are you out of your mind?" Her words were a cacophony of anger and panic, but I stayed silent. It was their evening, their betrayal, their conspiracy. Now it was coming back to haunt them. I listened to her rant and then calmly hung up. Alone, I looked around the empty house. Once, it had been filled with laughter and plans for the future. Now, it was merely the place where this chapter of my life had ended. Taking a deep breath, I walked out the door without looking back. The calls continued. Their desperate voices pleaded with me, but I no longer felt any obligation to answer. I had made my move, exposed their deceit, and was ready to start anew, free from lies, pain, and manipulation. The unknown lay ahead, but it no longer frightened me. After leaving the house I had once called home, I spent the night at a friend's place. The night felt endlessly long. My thoughts swirled in a chaotic vortex, anger giving way to pain, pain to determination. I realized there was one final, inevitable confrontation ahead. As the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, clarity descended on me. It was time to end this for good. I arrived at Mark and Linda's house, where I had felt like a stranger in recent months. Their faces, a mix of anger, confusion, and smugness, greeted me at the door. On the table in front of them were divorce papers, clearly prepared for their version of the scenario. There was a challenge in their eyes, but I had no intention of backing down. Linda spoke first, her voice dripping with contempt. "So, you've come crawling back to continue embarrassing us?" I met her gaze directly and confidently, not allowing even a shadow of doubt to cross my face. "I'm not here to crawl, Linda. I'm here to finish this. For the divorce." Mark, who not long ago had smugly announced his intention to divorce me, suddenly changed his tone. His voice was filled with a strange mix of confusion and regret. "Pamela, maybe we can talk about this. It was a mistake. I didn't mean it." I raised a hand to stop him. "Mark, your mistake wasn't fleeting. It was deliberate, continuous, and well documented." I placed a folder of evidence on the table, photos, audio recordings, and the detective's reports. A heavy silence filled the room. Linda, trying to regain control, smirked, her tone venomous. "Do you think you can just walk away and leave us with nothing? You're nothing without us." I slowly placed the documents on the table and leaned toward her so that each word I spoke was clear and left no room for doubt. "Actually, Linda, it's you who will be left with nothing. According to our prenuptial agreement, Mark owes me $100,000 for his infidelity." Linda's eyes widened in shock, and Mark's face turned pale. They exchanged glances, their bravado starting to crumble. "That's impossible," Mark muttered, struggling to find the words. But the evidence was indisputable. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. "You can try to contest it, but as you can see, all the evidence is here. I suggest you pay and move on. It's that simple." Mark looked defeated, and for the first time, Linda was speechless. Her face, usually smug and self-assured, was now a mix of anger and helplessness. I didn't say anything more. Rising from my seat, I walked toward the door, feeling the silence settle behind me. When the door closed, the sound felt final, as though I had put a period on a chapter that had tormented me for too long. The calls and pleas began almost immediately. I knew Mark would have to borrow money from his parents to fulfill the terms of the prenuptial agreement. But I didn't care. The source of the money didn't matter. What mattered was that I had settled the score, not just financially, but emotionally. It was closure. Sitting in the lawyer's office, signing the final papers, I felt a peace I hadn't known in a long time. The process had been painful, but it had taught me so much: how to see people's true faces, how to stand up for myself, and how to let go of things that no longer brought joy. As I stepped out of the office into the sunlight, the world felt different. The air was fresh, the sky brighter. I was a free woman, ready to start anew. The future stretched out before me, uncertain but no longer intimidating. For the first time in a long time, I felt strong, independent, and ready to shape my destiny. Step by step, I moved forward, leaving the darkness behind. And with every new step, I grew more certain that something better awaited me. Now I could begin again, armed with the knowledge of my strength, my worth, and the understanding that I deserved so much more.